The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. Is fishing a sport? Well, it was at one point during the Olympics. Now, the details are a bit fishy. Sorry for that pun. But fishing was an unofficial event during the 1900 Olympic Games in Paris. About 600 fishermen from 6 countries competed, but nearly all of them were from France. There seemed to be some confusion among the competitors, with some anglers going for the biggest fish and throwing the smaller ones back into the Seine, while the winner was the person who actually caught the most fish. And I'd love to tell you who won, but that was not recorded at the time, or at least not in the official records. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. We're looking back at a very exciting doubleheader IndyCar weekend in Iowa. We've got wins for Scott McLaughlin and Will Power. A pair of Penske wins, their 9th out of 11 attempts at Iowa, but perhaps not the drivers we expected with Joseph Newgarden, the usual dominator at Iowa. We also had a very, very rare mistake from Alex Palou with a crash and some less infrequent instances of bad luck for Colton Herta. He seems to get a lot of those, especially on ovals. I'm sure we'll get into those in a little bit later in the show. We'll also have Will Power on the show. He's joining us after winning Iowa for the first time. It seems incredible to say that about Will after a lengthy career where he's won at lots of different tracks, but Iowa wasn't one of them, even though he had double poles there last year and has been strong there in the past. It's just one that he's never quite been able to get over the line. So he'll be coming up later in the show to talk to us all about that. I've got JR Hildebrand with me alongside, of course, and the one thing I really wanted to start on JR with was after Scott McLaughlin scored his first ever IndyCar oval win in the first race on Saturday night. He said that he felt that he was a proper IndyCar driver because he'd won on an oval for the first time. JR, I'm desperate to get your thoughts on this because we've got some really strong drivers in the series. Alex Palou, Colton Herta, two that immediately spring to mind that haven't won on an oval yet. Scott did clarify after the second race in the press conference where he was sat alongside Alex Palou and was like, sorry, that wasn't some sort of dig at you because you haven't won an oval race yet. And there was like a funny little exchange where Alex Palou said that I'm basically 50% an IndyCar driver because he hadn't won on an oval yet, despite being a double champion in the series. I guess it's interesting. Like, I feel like for me, it would apply maybe more if you had someone who'd been, well, I guess Palou is a multiple champion and hasn't won on ovals. I don't think you can say that Alex Palou isn't like an established IndyCar driver or a proper IndyCar driver based on all of the experience he's had. But there's definitely something in the psyche of a driver when they haven't won on an oval. It seems to eat away at them, and it is such a big part of IndyCar racing. It's one of the, I guess, the USPs of the championship that you race on all of these different types of tracks. There's no other open wheel series at this level that races on oval, street circuits and road courses. So I guess it is just one of those things that can eat away at a driver, I guess. But I'm just keen to get your thoughts on what you thought of what Scotty said and what your kind of general opinion is on it, really.
Well, I think he's right.
There's a shock.
And no, I think I love the mindset. I love that he, like, clearly this was kind of not, I don't know. It's hard to know if it's like bothering him or was bothering him or it bothers other guys or whatever that, Alex or Colton. But I do think that it's, I love that he looked at it this way because it really shows, to me, it just shows his commitment to excellence in IndyCar and a recognition of the fact that that means something different in IndyCar than it. I mean, I love it because it's just reflective of the things that as drivers or as industry professionals within motorsport, that we do know are special about the IndyCar series, that sometimes it's hard to it's hard to really know if those things matter as much to people outside of the series or not, or whatever. Like, is this resonating with people that that this is difficult because it's different in this way than other things, than Formula One or sports car racing or whatever else that are a little bit more one dimensional in terms of, the types of, certainly the different types of things that you have to be able to do to compete at a high level for championships within the series. In the IndyCar series, it's just there's no way to get around it, particularly in seasons like we have this year, where there are actually just there's a lot of points being tallied in oval races. There's kind of no way to get around the fact that you do have to be a good oval driver to be able to accomplish that. And so I think in some respects, like Alex and Colton are not good examples of this being the other way around somehow, that they're managing to compete for championships, or in Alex's case, or be stars of the series, we'll say, just more generally in Colton's case, without having, it's one thing to say they haven't won on ovals. It's a completely different thing to say that they're not capable of that, or they're not any good on ovals, because we clearly know that both of those guys, it's just a matter of time. Like, they've both run up front and shown the same kind of excellence that McLaughlin was able to take advantage of here to finally notch one. But I think for me, it's more just, I find myself sort of standing back from the IndyCar series a lot these days, just and it's been this way for me for a long time, because I think I've always, even when I was racing full time or when I first got into the series, there's always a part of me that just thinks about motorsport as a fan and less as a driver. Once you become intimately familiar with racing in IndyCar, and you become kind of a part of that community, you do recognize how different it is, and the things that do differentiate it and do make it unique and make it hard to do in its own particular way. And so it's sort of just, in a way, and that a lot of those things maybe are not quite extreme or excessive enough for them to just, totally unquestionably resonate beyond being inside the paddock in some ways. Like, you have to become intimately familiar with them to recognize that, this part of this thing we do is actually really weird and different and hard. And so it's kind of cool, not being, obviously I haven't been racing full time. I haven't been in the paddock full time, to hear this younger crop of guys who didn't come up through the American open wheel ladder, to just feel that for themselves and have that perspective of it. For McLaughlin, it probably doesn't help that he's got Newgarden and Will Power as his teammates, who are like often dominant at these kinds of places. So he's had a very high bar to reach just within his own team. Like, I'm sure it's really been front and center that he's, not winning at these places, because one of his teammates has often been the one winning at these places. I guess I wouldn't take it quite to the extreme of, like, you're not a proper IndyCar driver if you haven't won on an oval, but or if you've like been winning at other places and haven't been winning on the ovals. But there's no question in my mind that it is being great on ovals is a part of being great in the IndyCar series for sure. And so that I guess through that lens, I definitely agree with Scott on this one. And it was just it was cool in my own way to hear him say it, because it does, it really drives home, the fact that, at least for the drivers that are having to do it weekend to weekend, they really do appreciate that this is this, entirely unique thing that you have to be, in one championship, you have to be a multidisciplinary driver, to really showcase excellence on a weekend to weekend basis.
Yeah. Well, Scott, obviously winning his first oval race, and did that in pretty straightforward fashion. If we're being truly honest about it, he assumed the lead at the first round of pit stops and looked pretty untouchable after that, despite a a flurry of late restarts, let's say. He just looked very, very comfortable at the front there. And although I did have kind of in the back of my mind a couple of Texases where he's finished second, specifically the 2022 edition where Joseph Newgarden passed him at the last corner on the last lap, it just didn't feel like that was going to be the case this time, and that Scott was going to be able to get the job done. During that race that Scott McLaughlin won, Will Power had a bit of a nightmare, really. He had two pit lane speeding penalties that put him well out of action, and then he clipped Pietro Fittipaldi under basically just before a restart, and that earned him another penalty and ended up finishing pretty far down the order, but managed to rebound in the second race with a pretty fantastic bit of strategy calling from Penske. Obviously, a lot of fortune involved in that as well. He came from, I think it was 20th on the grid he came from, and basically just stayed out longer than anybody else in a round of pit stops. And the caution came out, he was able to pit and come back out in second place behind Alex Palou. Managed to work his way forward and take a first victory at Iowa, as I mentioned, which was particularly, just felt weird that Will hadn't. I know Will's kind of journey on ovals has been talked about a lot over the years, when he first came into the series and trying to tick some of those tracks off and try and improve and adapt to some of these kind of tricky, especially shorter ovals, trying to learn what's needed to win on them. I know that was a big part of his early career, but it just felt like at some point he should have won Iowa, and he hasn't been able to do it. And I know that had been eating away at him as well. So as I mentioned, a 9th win in 11 tries at Iowa, Simon Pagenaud and Joseph Newgarden, the other winners, alongside Will Power and now Scott McLaughlin as well. The other big talking point, I guess, was just the lack of overtaking on track generally, JR. We did an episode last week. You can go back and listen to that, where we previewed the hybrid coming in at Iowa for its debut. I feel like the hybrid was barely talked about over the course of the weekend, which was a little bit disappointing. I know it was talked about on the broadcast a little bit, but I felt like when you were speaking to the drivers and people involved in the weekend, there wasn't very much talk about it having much of an impact, other than when people had mechanical issues or had trouble with the unit. And then obviously it does become a talking point because it impacts people's results and performances. Just on the performance of the track, JR, I guess we should recap this quickly. You can go back and listen to last week's episode in a lot of detail, but there was a lot of question marks coming into this track because it's been repaved. We've obviously got new tyres. We've got a heavier car because of the hybrid being installed. We've obviously got big temperature changes between a Saturday night race and a Sunday kind of afternoon race as well. And downforce being reduced from the pre-event test to the race weekend. So we've got all of these kind of mishmashes of changes and uncertainties coming into the race weekend. We even had a high line practice to try and bring that rubber in higher up the racetrack. We've seen that happen at other tracks. And I think going into the weekend, although at the test there wasn't too wide racing, I think there was enthusiasm and hope that there was going to be able to be a more sort of too wide racing than what we saw. We basically saw none after the restarts. I guess in part due to the track being swept during cautions, or obviously before the race, the track was clean. And as soon as we had sort of 5 to 10 laps after a restart, I think the rubber was building up a little bit higher up, making it a bit slippier. It was difficult for people to go up high. We saw some people able to do it, but a lot of people not able to do it. Some of the kind of key quotes I'll pick out for you. We had Pato O'Ward saying that they'd ruined a fantastic race. We had Alex Palou say after the race on Sunday, he said it was a bit of a boring race for everybody. It's the most boring thing I've ever done. It was yesterday as well. And Will Power said that basically we need to look at this and change what we do before we come back next year and really adapt to this. I think a lot of this, JR, is a symptom of just having too many uncertainties coming into this weekend. Part of the reason of doing a pre-event test is to get some data and give the teams a chance to adapt and learn. And it was probably the case for IndyCar as well, with a hybrid unit, to get more of an idea of how that might work at Iowa. But then to take off a load of downforce and change things significantly seems like, contrary to what a test should be, really, in terms of like kind of gain some information and data and try and apply that to what might happen over the course of the race weekend. Quite a lot of negativity from the drivers, but we did see some drivers able to make that high line work on occasion. I don't think it was quite as bad as maybe some people have made it out to be. But then that's probably because we've kind of gotten used to some of these races in recent years at the likes of Gateway and Texas, where it's been a struggle to get that high line, and maybe we're a bit more numb to it now because we've seen it fairly often recently. I'm kind of interested. I know we've talked about IndyCar on the whole in terms of the direction it's going, wider thoughts about a new car and how that might change things, and some of these inherent issues that we see on some of these short ovals are caused by things that can't really change in the short term and are difficult to adapt to. Maybe I'm kind of interested in how you felt, just generally your thoughts on how you felt the two races were, and do you think they were, it's subjective to everyone, isn't it? How good you think an IndyCar race was, and a lot of people will see, the person who's won 5 of the last 7 races here not winning the 2 races as a success in terms of creating some interest and seeing something a little bit different. But I think it's clear that the drivers were not happy with how the track performed and how this package performed on this track. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how you felt about the whole thing, really.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just picking apart a few of those things, I guess just working backwards a little bit. I would 100% sell the idea that just because we were seeing somebody else win, that means that it's better somehow. And mainly for the reason that, particularly in the IndyCar series, when everything is so closely matched, if you see somebody dominating somewhere, it's because you're witnessing something really special going on. You're witnessing a driver actually do something really impressive. And so just on those grounds alone, like that to me is not criteria for, picking an event or a way that things happen out and saying, that's better given the set of circumstances. If you've got like an F1 like situation and everybody's just getting crushed by a team because they have an enormous competitive advantage, like, yeah, okay, like you'd like to see that change. But and we've talked about this. This is like a tangent off into a whole different realm, but is the idea that like you have different winners all the time actually better? Is that actually serving IndyCar like in a positive way, in any particular fashion? I mean, it all just comes back to like, why is all of this occurring? And so what are sort of the root causes for all of this? And are those aligned around like the right value proposition or not? But my general point of view on this race and the track and kind of what's gone on here, I definitely agree generally with the idea that there was just a lot of unknowns coming into this weekend. And so, we shouldn't too harshly criticize or whatever, critique one way or the other what occurred here this weekend. There are things that can change. You can bring a different tire. Firestone can bring a different tire. They can bring a different aero package to try to adjust on these things. Both of those things definitely can have a fairly significant impact on how this race goes in the future as well, and I'll kind of break down why I think that's the case. I guess one thing, just to talk about the track, it was actually the first time that I saw cars running around the track. So even from what I was kind of hearing from people at the test to just watching practice, it clarified a lot of the things that, a lot of like what's between the lines, basically, from what I was hearing, just watching it. I was kind of picturing a slightly different sort of scenario. People were talking about the idea that you could only run the bottom lane. I was sort of imagining for myself that was because the resurfacing didn't go far enough up the track. Like it was a little bit more like the the inverse of the PJ1 situation at Texas, that it was just like there was a really narrow band that was repaved, and that was why you had only one lane. Turns out that that's not true. There was quite a bit of, like, basically the entire second lane was also repaved. So there had some other things been in play, I think you would have ended up with more cars running the second lane. It's worth understanding that at Iowa in particular, the second lane, the real reason for using the second lane, like the first reason to start using the second lane, is to get clean air by when you're running super close to a car in front of you, is just to get a little bit of clean air through the corner, basically. So it's just to offset against the car in front of you. That historically has been well, at least in my experience, that was always the first reason that I would start moving up into the second lane through 3 and 4, was not because it was faster. It wasn't even necessarily because I thought that I was getting better tire degradation, although that was something that I think I factored in often, was like, by running the second lane, it's a little bit more banked. You're just like, the peak load on the car is not as high in the middle of the corner. Like, you're not having to work the car through the center of the corner down on the bottom quite as much as quite as much as you do when you're down on the bottom. So you get a bit more like consistent arc and as such loading of the car through the center, particularly in 3 and 4. But that, I guess, with those things said, because that's the case, in this situation, the bottom lane was just so fast that you got no benefit from doing that. Basically, like, you'd have to, because the bottom lane was so fast and the tire deg was so insignificant, that if you did start to move up, like let's just say, for the sake of argument, the second lane was usable and was clean, um, it would take guys until you're like 3/4 of the way through a stint for that to be anything other than just a complete disadvantage to go up into the second lane, basically. Um, and so because that wasn't happening, it never got cleaned off. Like, so nobody was using it enough. Like, guys were using it for like the first 2 laps, basically, after the initial start or restarts. It kind of stayed clean for a couple of laps, but it never got rubbered in through practice or anything else. So even at that point, it just immediately became this situation where once the whole field is kind of moving, like once everybody's up to some relative pace after a start or a restart, there's just no gain to using the second lane, because there's nowhere near as much grip. I mean, in a way, you almost it reminded me in some respects, from that perspective, of Laguna last year after the repave, that it was kind of like, it just became this 1 lane racetrack. Like, anytime anybody even tried to go for a pass, on the inside, on the outside, anywhere, you got caught offline, even if the track was clean. Just the difference in grip, because the repave, it's funny because you think about it like, oh, well, the repave is just grippier everywhere. Well, it is, but then the first event that it really rubbers in, it's like way extra grippier just on the one place that it's rubbering in. And so, IndyCar tried to run the highline practice. They kind of did, to your point, they sort of did everything they could once they actually saw what it was going to be like. And they obviously proactively did the highline practice after hearing from people on the test day having concerns about, there's not going to be a second lane. And that's even them being pretty, I mean, that's them really listening to everybody, because I've been to a bunch of test days at Iowa before. Like, it's kind of rare that you end up with a second lane on a test day one way or the other. So, this is like teams saying something that they're concerned about, them maybe not even being totally convinced themselves that it's actually going to be one way or the other. IndyCar taking that insight, wanting to do whatever they can to make sure there's a second lane, and it just turning into a situation that it's like, it just wasn't going to happen without there being more of a naturally occurring reason for cars to go up into the second lane, which basically comes from there being some downside at some point to running the bottom, which, because the tire deg didn't really become a thing, and the bottom was just so fast, basically, that you didn't really. I mean, the last time I can remember at least being in an IndyCar race that was kind of more like this was back prior to this car at all, even in the first place, like 2011. It was a night race, so it was, just track temp was so cool that the track was really fast. Basically you ran the top lane through 3 and 4 when you were right on top of somebody, and it was basically just because you were running flat out the entire way around the lap, one way or the other, basically through an entire stint. And you just had to do something to try to like offset to the car in front of you to try to switch them up and get underneath them by half a car length going into turn one. Like that was the only way you could pass a car. And it just so happened that because of the tires and because the second lane was still good enough and you didn't have any of these weird, repaving aspects of the thing, that like that there were enough cars doing that over the course of the race that at least through half of the corners on the track, like at least through one end of the track, it stayed clean enough that you could continue to do that throughout the event. I think the other thing that really didn't help, which also factored into why you saw some of the accidents that occurred, and also why it really was just a one lane track, was that the repaving didn't extend back into the turn in far enough on either end of the track. And so basically you saw like Marcus Ericsson's accident in practice was a good example of it. And you saw this, like Ericsson actually was one of the cars that you saw this from in qualifying. Guys bending in basically where you would usually bend into the corner. Like just if you just mapped out like where's the right turn-in point, assuming that there's not like a difference in grip through the corner, it's very late at Iowa. You want to be able to confidently bend in, not sharply, but like you want to wait a long time, slow-handed in late, arc for like a late apex through the corner and let the car, explode off the corner, like let the car accelerate off the corner by being able to unwind your hands. Whether, bottom lane, second lane, whatever, either way. But we'll just say like kind of a qualifying lap. If you did that, you were turning in basically above where the repave had been done and then bending down onto the repaved part once the car is already pretty loaded up. So then the fronts really grab on where it's repaved and you get super nervous and loose at corner entry, which is like the sketchiest feeling ever on an oval. Like that's like you gotta not have that happen on a lap to lap basis. You're just asking for, a huge accident basically every time. And so for all of these things, like you just, basically when I was watching onboards, I'm like, yeah, everybody's having to turn in. You're turning in from like the straightaway, basically bending off the straightaway really early so that you can get the car set up going straight to return into the corner. Basically, once you get to where it's actually repaved, that's where you're loading the car up. You end up on the bottom early. I mean, that's not great, but it's like everybody just had to do it because you're risking all kinds of bad stuff happening if you actually just turn in where you think you should turn in. And then that makes it even less likely that a second lane comes in because there's no way to use the second lane. It's like you're either going to be risking that sketchy turn in every time because you just naturally have to turn in a little bit later to use the second lane because it's higher up on the track. Or you're going to end up doing some weird like bend in on the bottom and then almost, you're not literally turning right hand down to go up into the second lane, but like you're kind of turning right for a second to get, it's just, there was a bunch of factors basically that just made it all started. I mean, in my mind, if they had just repaved the entire track or the second lane had been fully repaved from entry to exit, at least like from straightaway to straightaway on both ends, that even might have been enough to make it so that at least you could arc in the right place to actually use the second lane properly. And you'd have enough cars that were good enough that you'd start to see that that were good enough relative to the car that they were in front of, that would start to happen. But I think for me, the thing that was really made it apparent that this was just not going to occur, that like you were not going to see real racing like anything like what we're used to, was the fact that basically once the leaders ever caught lap traffic, they were stuck there, and that there was a number of times that you had P2 fairly close, like within close proximity to the actual leader of the race. The leader of the race totally stuck behind lap traffic. It kind of to your point about like, the Texas race where Scott got jumped by Newgarden at the very end of the race. That was kind of just because Scott was catching up generally to some lap cars, like in a bad part of the track or whatever. There wasn't even that potential basically for a second or third car for position to take advantage of the leader getting stacked up behind a bunch of lap cars. Like it kind of ended up in this, processional parade of cars that you couldn't even, I think if you were at the track and you weren't looking at the car, like if you didn't know what the car numbers were on track, you'd have no idea who the leader was at some point, because it's kind of just nose to tail, going around all over the place. So I guess I think that there are some things in the way that the track was repaved that are inherently going to make it difficult for a second lane to come in and for this to really be like what it used to. But higher tire drag, less aero, those kinds of things would at least make it so that it would at least make it so that your approach would be different, and it'd be at least slightly more likely that you start to get guys trying to rubber in the second lane, because the detriment to like running a little higher up is much less.
Will Power had a theory that he reckons the car's too heavy, and that basically when you add downforce, it overloads the tire. I know there's two prevailing like opinions. You either add downforce or take it off, right? That's like it's not really much you can do. Like you've got two ways to go. You do one or the other. But Will's basically saying that if you go down the adding downforce route, then at the moment the car's so heavy that you overwork the tire. So that's not really at the moment not really a solution. And that's part of Will's campaign to have lighter Indy cars, which he's been on for a long time now, and he's not the only one who would like to see that in the next IndyCar. He also talked about the lap traffic you were mentioning there, and that he was basically just like backing up going into corners where there was a lapped car in front of him, really focusing on getting a great exit out of the corner, knowing that the person behind would have to do the same thing, and that they would all just be doing this kind of like concertina effect of like everyone's got a great run down the straight, everyone's backing off and slow into the corners. There's no variation between what anyone's doing, and it's just everyone's just sat there doing nothing. But anyway, less of me paraphrasing Will Power. Let's go and speak to the man himself. He won a race at the weekend. I'm keen to get his thoughts. We'll take a quick break and then we'll come back with Will Power.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
All right, Will Power, welcome back to the Race IndyCar Podcast, and congratulations on winning your first race at Iowa. Give us a little bit of a flavour of how that feels to be this far into your career with so many accolades, and to still be able to tick something new off the list. It's a pretty cool thing to be able to do, right?
It is. Yeah, I have tried to win that race for years. Had many poles and second places, podiums, but was never able to clinch the deal. But it was, I would say, unexpected starting that race.
Yeah.
From where I did, starting in 22nd, just after feeling how the race went the night before, I was like, this is very difficult to pass. So it's all in the pit stop sequences and in and out laps and where yellows fall. So I had a plan going into that race to run as long as I possibly can with the chance of catching yellow, but also just to overcut people with the lighter car, warm tires, because there was no degradation. So either way, that was sort of the plan. Catching the yellow was just like the cherry on top, you could say.
Yeah, definitely. Did it feel more rewarding after the Saturday? I mean, there's quite often in IndyCar where you get to a situation where you'll have, a single race on a weekend rather than a double header, and you kind of have to stew for the next sort of like 2 or 3 weeks over things that have gone wrong, maybe things that you could have done differently, or things that have, not gone your way, bad luck and stuff like that. But with the double header, at least you're able to bounce back from that difficult Saturday and kind of go into the next couple of races here with a bit more momentum that you maybe would have had before.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to rebound that quickly because you would have been stewing for a week on the little mistakes I made on the first day there. I was anticipating being further back in the points, leaving that weekend, knowing where I was starting on Sunday. So it was really a pleasant surprise to have actually closed the gap over that weekend. And yeah, I was very disappointed that on the Saturday night when I didn't capitalize on Palou having a bad day. We were running in that top 5 and just accidentally clicked off the PLC, which gave me a penalty. But we're right in the game now. We certainly are, and got some good tracks coming up. I mean, just the ovals, I think, will be more mixed up as far as results go, but I feel like we have good cars on all the ovals coming up. So we'll see how it plays out. As you know, there's no guarantees in this game. There's just absolutely no guarantees, but all you can do is your absolute best every time you're out there and try extract the most out of each race, each weekend.
Yeah. I know you've obviously not come from not an oval racing background in the sense of, before you came to IndyCar and stuff, you hadn't done any, obviously like proper top level oval racing like we see in IndyCar. It's been I guess it's a long journey for any driver who doesn't come from that background and has to learn all of this stuff. What would you go back and tell yourself at the start of your career? Because you've come so far in the space of your career in terms of, figuring out some of these more tricky ovals. Obviously, a lot of them are so different in terms of how you approach them and how you drive them. And I guess you've always had the problem of, well, most of your career, you've had the problem of having, the great problem of having a great car with Team Penske, but also having great teammates that you then have to beat in the same equipment at the same time as well. So yeah. I guess it's been a kind of a long road. What would you go back and tell yourself at the start? And is there anything in particular that you feel like you've really learned over the years that has made this more easy for you?
Well, the ovals in particular are definitely quite a different discipline to road and street courses, just because you have to be very good at understanding, how the car feels and relaying that information and understanding what changes to make it comfortable for you, because you simply cannot drive around a bad handling car. So there's not much I could have done early in my career. I just happened to be in one of those transition teams that came from Champ Car, which didn't do ovals. So we didn't really have any information. So it was a really tough introduction into ovals compared to like some of the rookies that come in now. These teams are so well established with their oval setups that they know how to make the car comfortable, and they know the changes to make. So yeah, that was some of the reason I struggled on ovals. I lost a lot of confidence because when you hit the wall on an oval, and you don't quite know why did it just, what's going to stop it doing that again? Just have a sudden snap. They're the things that, just lose your confidence. It takes a long time to get that trust back in the car. So that was sort of my introduction into oval. So it wasn't fun. And obviously I've learned a tremendous amount since and have a very good feel for all that stuff. And there's no substitute for experience, I would say, in the oval game. But like you say, I've got teammates. In particular Joseph, who's been the best on ovals in the last 4 years. He's really won more oval races than anyone by a long shot. And you learn. I've never stopped learning. I learn off all these guys. I'm continually learning, and they're just kind of lucky in that respect. Lucky and unlucky, you got tough teammates, but you get great information you got to try beat those guys, which is hard, but that's been the case for me for most of my career.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard what your teammate Scotty Mack said after the win, but he'd said he didn't feel like he could call himself an IndyCar driver until he'd won on an oval, and obviously you come from a more traditional background like Scotty does, in the sense of doing more kind of road courses and stuff. What do you remember about winning your first oval race, and do you kind of understand where Scott's coming from when he says he doesn't really feel like he can call himself an IndyCar driver until you win an oval race, or do you have a different opinion to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd never ever looked at him in that way at all. It didn't even really occur to me that he hadn't won an oval, but it's not something I was thinking about. To me, he was a fully established IndyCar driver just by the fact he'd won races.
Yeah.
I remember my first oval win, very satisfying. Just considering my introduction into ovals, how sort of rough it was. It's probably a little bit of that in your mind. Like when you start winning some ovals, you start to really feel like you're the complete package, which that is, to win these championships, you have to be a complete package. You got to be able to win on all the disciplines. That's what makes this series so tough. Because none of the ovals are the same either. They're all very different. Some of the street courses we race are very unique to any other street course in any other racing in the world as well. So it's a tough one. It's a tough series. It's a very satisfying series when you get wins, or just honestly when you finish a race in IndyCar. Rarely do you feel like it was a boring or not exciting race. Like you've always got something going on because you're just constantly battling with people.
Yeah. You mentioned the tracks coming up there, the rest of the season, 6 races left. How do you kind of feel going into these? I mean, you could look at it on a piece of paper and say that obviously you and Scott have done some of these older, some of the tracks that are coming back, like Milwaukee and Nashville before. But I guess I don't know how much of an advantage you feel that gives you over some of the guys who maybe haven't done those tracks before, or do you think that, by the time we've got our first practice in, then pretty much everyone's going to be up to speed, and it's going to be more about the car underneath you as opposed to any experience you might be able to bring from sort of 10 years ago or anything like that, really?
I would say Milwaukee, there's a little bit of experience there because that is a unique oval. It's flat and the different lines. Just, it's pretty obvious to these guys that haven't raced there. They got the test there. It was actually quite difficult to pass, which is different to how it was when I raced there last time. So. To me it's going to be an interesting end to the year because it's not your typical finishing with road courses. Ovals are a different game, more mixed up, and ovals aren't exactly Palou's forte. What I mean by that is he's very capable of winning them, but he's not capable, I don't think, yet of just absolutely dominating people like he does on road and street courses. Like he is. If you're looking at 4 road courses to finish, you'd be like, this dude could totally dominate the end of this season. But with it being an oval, you're like, well, it's going to be a tough fight. It's going to be a tough fight. I think Blue will be right at the front in all of them and battling. But on a road courses where he can just, as we saw last year, he can just put it together so well, qualify well, race well. He's got that perfect balance going. And I mean, he's right there at Iowa as well. So it's I look at the 5-6 guys that are in the game. They're all it's a tight fight, man. like I said, there's no guarantees. It's anyone's capable of winning this championship from here out. Just Palou has the advantage right now, and will be tough to beat, but we're certainly right there in the game.
Do you feel like you've kind of picked up where you left off in 2022? And kind of what I mean by that is you obviously had this new approach for 2022 where you felt like you got into a bit of a different mental state before that season started, and you were really strong all the way through that season. And I know you've spoken at length about last season and all of the kind of trials and tribulations you had there, but does it feel this year that you're kind of back towards that 2022, situation where you were able to I guess, well, you spoke about it yourself, being able to bounce back from things that went wrong, not letting things affect you too much, not worrying about things that were outside of your control, and just worrying about the things that you could really have an impact on. Does it feel like you've just kind of picked up where you left off there?
Yes. I mean, the preparation to the season was significantly better than the year before as well. I mean, it's fitness and all the things that I do to prepare for a season, mentally, physically, I would say going into 23, I just was not in the game. I was not. I just couldn't be even like sort of doubts of whether I should even be racing. But yeah, I'm back to where I was in 22 and just improving upon that as well. But I'm just in that, got to be in that calm state. It'll be what it'll be, but bloody make sure you do your homework and put that effort in, because it doesn't just fall in your lap. I'm sorry. It's got to be a hard fought deal, and that's the goal.
Yeah. I guess has it changed? You said you thought about whether you should be racing. Where's your mind kind of at now in terms of, I mean, obviously we've got a very important run of races coming up here, and I'm sure you're not thinking too big picture about your future, but has last year changed how you think about how long you'll race and how that might impact your career, or are you still kind of just ticking things off here and just...
No, it's still rolling. The concern for me last year was if something happened to my wife, I just didn't need to be doing anything risky where my son doesn't end up with any parents. So that was weighing heavily on me. But now I'm back into my mindset. I'm not even thinking about, when I might stop and all that. Like, as long as I'm firing on all cylinders and motivated to win week in, week out, it's tough to want to stop when you're in my situation with the team I'm in and you're having chances to win each week. So, just focus on a race at a time.
Yeah, no reason to stop now while everything's going so well, I guess. I guess I finally we mentioned Scotty Mac earlier and wanted to ask you kind of if you could give some of your insight into what he's been like to work with and his journey, because this it's kind of been incredible. This kind of 4-year period he's been on where he's gone from, racing in supercars to these achievements he's having in IndyCar. And I know this has been spoken about before, but it feels especially poignant after his first, oval win, and obviously had the Indy 500 pole earlier in the year. I'm sure it's helpful just from a Team Penske point of view to be able to rely on someone operating at that level to be able to bounce off him and have some ideas from him as well. But just kind of interested in your general thoughts on that journey that he's been on and how well he's kind of performing at the moment.
Yeah, it was I think a very strong transition from what he was doing. I think the thing that helped him a lot was the fact that he'd been at a very high level in a high level series, and kind of had made all those rookie mistakes and everything. I think his approach to it was very, very methodical, and he got up to speed relatively quick, but then he's just slowly gaining the experience and understanding the flow of IndyCar races and all the little intricacies that, with fuel save and tire save and how you race. I think the one lap speed has always been there for him, and then obviously ovals on top of that. So he's right there. I mean, absolute championship contender now, which, I think that was the goal for him, was in his 3rd or 4th year, he needed to be vying for the championship, which he is. He's pretty complete driver now. He's one of the top guys in IndyCar, and bloody impressive coming from where he did. But when you see, the series he came from is ultra competitive as well. So, it's right there in him. And I think if you're fast in any sort of series, you're top level in any series, you usually can transition if you're young enough.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Will, thanks for joining us on the podcast. We really appreciate it. We wish you all the best of luck for the final 6 races. It's going to be fascinating for us to watch on the outside. I'm sure you're looking forward to getting your teeth into it and getting this season finished. So best of luck with it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, JR, great to hear from Will, but we need to move on quickly. We've got a lot to get through. Before we do that, We'll be back to our race recap in a moment, but first of all, a couple of quick shout outs. Firstly, you can find all of the races podcasts on YouTube Music now, including the Race IndyCar podcast. So definitely head over there. If you're into YouTube Music, go and check it out. And secondly, if you love what we do here at the race and you want an ad-free and additional podcast content, you can find us on Patreon. So you can head to patreon.com/the race, and that's where you can sign up and find more information on that. JR, I wanted to get into a little bit of the championship permutations because we had this massive event on Saturday, which was Alex Palou making what he called an unacceptable error, where he lost the car coming off turn 4. He'd already had a stall in the pits and dropped way down the order from his third place starting spot. But that kind of whole thing where he finished 23rd opened the door for a lot of drivers. So I wanted to quickly mention a few of those and give you a brief idea of kind of what happened. So Will Power winning that second race, he made up 13 points on Alex Palou over the course of the weekend. Other drivers who made up, Pato O'Ward made 18 points, Scott Dixon made 14, and Scott McLaughlin, the big winner from the weekend, making up 39 points on Alex Palou over the course of the weekend, which was, pretty awesome to see those gaps falling. Obviously not nice to see Alex Palou making a mistake. Not nice to see that happen. No one wants to see any drivers having that happen to them, but also it just kind of reminds us that he isn't a robot and he is human and is capable of making mistakes. We've seen those points tighten up a bit, so we'll definitely be keeping an eye out. We've only got 6 races to go, and remember that Will Power and Scott Dixon have both got experience of some of those races later in the year, like Milwaukee and Nashville, that the other drivers don't have experience of. And Pato O'Ward, we know his form on some of these short ovals, especially places like Gateway, so it's going to be super interesting to see how they all get on there. One more thing I wanted to get into with JR, I think we've spoken about double headers before, and I think if I remember rightly, you're kind of against oval double headers, but I'll let you address that in a second. Alex Palou was asked about it, and he was basically saying that it was really difficult for the crews at the weekend, and I wanted to kind of echo those sentiments, because basically anyone who had any issues on Saturday night, they were looking at like an hour or 2 hours sleep before they were back at the track the next day to work on the car. So even if we just throw like racing on track out of the window here for a second, it's an awful situation for the crew guys to be in, especially if you have an issue. But even if we're just talking like a mechanical issue where no one's really to blame, you're still looking at the potential for some really late nights. And Alex was asked about that from a racing standpoint as well, and he said he's just always against them. He just prefers the just one race and get things out the way. On the previous point, while we were talking about drivers who made up points, that it did just offer, even though the racing wasn't fantastic, if we just think about this now from like a hindsight perspective of just looking back over the course of the weekend, we got some massive swings in the championship in terms of like Saturday night, there was a massive switch with Palou making that mistake, and obviously he kind of ruined that by doing really well the next day and scoring a podium to come back and add some more of those points. There was very few of his title rivals that beat him on Sunday, obviously, Will Power being the main one. But yeah, I thought this was an interesting time to kind of take stock of oval double headers. We've got more of them coming up with Milwaukee as well, and kind of that where they place on the calendar and what their role is. I know like COVID, they were very popular because they gave us the number of kind of races that you wanted on the calendar and gave people that, that on-track action that they were craving. I guess now I'm just kind of thinking like we're getting more ovals on the calendar, and that's a good thing, but these double headers seem to be quite controversial in some ways for different reasons. But I just kind of wondered what your take on the whole thing was in terms of just like the downsides and the upsides of having them on the calendar, and what you thought of Iowa in that context.
Yeah, before we get into that, I'm actually curious, did Alex talk in any of the post-race interviews after the first race about what actually happened when he lost it? Because it was a really weird, like I was sitting there watching it thinking like, I wonder if he was like pushing a button on the steering wheel or something. Like it just seemed like it happened so late in the corner, and it just seemed like a very catchable, like it just struck me that something bizarre must have been going on in the cockpit.
He said it was a bit surprising where it happened. It happened really late. I was not trying to make a pass or anything. Having said that, the tyres are really old. He said nothing broke mechanically on the car. I just lost it. He said, it was not easy for the car for the team to turn it round. And he said he reckoned his team got like 3 hours sleep turning it around. So
yeah,
that's where he said, I can tell you what he said. He said, I never support double headers in IndyCar, like not even on a road course. It's not because I'm not good at Iowa or anything like that. I think it's a great race and it's good to have it here. The fans enjoy it for one day. He said we can put so much effort into one race, everybody can relax a little bit more. It's not so hard on the cars and especially on our crews. Then if it's a bad race, you can have a double header of bad races. And he said like we had this weekend, but he I don't think it was necessary. Like I can see what he means by bad weekend in the context of the championship, but I don't think most people would call what he had a bad weekend just because of how well he did in the second race, and the balance of like how the weekend went was actually not that bad for him overall. But I kind of see his point. But anyway, that was his thoughts on the doubleheader and the incident. He didn't blame the crash on anything in particular. He just said it was a mistake.
Well, I think if you were messing with something and that's why you crashed, I don't think you'd say it either. So that's fair enough.
Correct.
So I guess I would. Well, and I think that he's saying a bad weekend in the context of his other earlier comments, or the comments that we mentioned earlier in the pod about him thinking that it was just like a bad race to watch or to be in.
Yeah, that's also like
you basically double up on, like, if it's a quote unquote good race, like for fans or for IndyCar or whatever, then maybe you double up on that, but you're doubling up on it being.
It was also good for him because he got to bounce back so quickly, because normally he would have had to have waited like 3 or 4 weeks to get back in the car, right?
Right. So, that's what I mean. I think he's just strictly talking about, like, I think he's saying bad race in the context of like he thinks it was like boring race, and so you're doubling up on it being a boring race.
That makes sense.
There's a few different ways of looking at this. If you look at it strictly from teams and drivers' perspectives, there's basically no upside to it. Like, there's, whether it's road course or oval, and I'm going to lump these all together just as doubleheaders generally, in terms of my point of view here, because it's not dramatically different road course versus oval. It's really hard on the teams, and I think there's another aspect of it that's hard on the teams, which is that you often end up in these situations where you've got a qualifying session, and this is particularly so on an oval because just the magnitude of, an impact if you do have something go wrong, crash, having to fix it, that's usually that's on a road course or street course or something, that's like more often than not is just a front wing and some, front suspension or something. On an oval, sometimes that's getting into like a gearbox change and all kinds of other stuff. So it also mashes together the rest of the schedule, which is in this context, I was sitting there watching qualifying like, man, I feel like as a team, it'd be hard to keep yourself from reminding your driver that you really need to not have something go wrong in qualifying because you got a like 2 or 3 hour turnaround to getting the thing on the grid for race 1. So there are the way the oval weekends work in general sometimes are kind of like that, but you usually have a bigger separation between the two most high risk like parts of the weekend, which are qualifying and the race. And so in these kind of doubleheader formats, not only do you have race 1, then race 2 with very little time to get prepped between those two things. It's also worth mentioning that there's a bunch of prep that has to happen basically immediately after the cars come off track, just one way or the other, even if you don't wreck the car or have something go wrong. So that's complicated. It just is going to be burning everybody out, basically, even if everything just goes great, basically. So I think that's worth mentioning to start with. You also have qualifying to the first race getting jammed together much more closely, which is another bit of added stress on teams and drivers. Just overall, they're very hectic, kind of chaotic, stressful weekends. I would say also from the perspective of a lot of teams and drivers, okay, if you're Penske showing up at Iowa and that you've got your stuff dialed, you're not like feeling like you're running around with your head cut off, but you get a lot less practice time in general for these kinds of weekends. It's not giving, if you don't roll off the truck with your shit together, it's not giving you a lot of time to figure any of that out. And so so one of the points that you made earlier, it will oftentimes just reward the teams that are already really good at these places, which I'm not sure is I certainly wouldn't chalk that up to being like a good thing necessarily. Is that the reason that you want to move away from double headers? Probably not. Like it's not the most significant thing to be like talking about here, but it's also definitely not great. Like you want for people to have a time. Like I want to see everybody at their best, basically. Like that's why I like Indianapolis as an event so much, is that you kind of know that everybody's had enough time to like figure out how they've had ample time to put ample resources and time towards like figuring stuff out. And so you're at least giving everybody that chance. You come to weekends like this, and it's a total crapshoot. Like it's a complete roll of the dice for a lot of teams. Like, all right, we're gonna hope that whatever work we did in the sim or whatever things that we've changed since the test day, if we even did the test day, are gonna work out okay. And that basically, if they're not, we're just stuck with it for the rest of the weekend. Like if we can't figure this out in one practice session, that, oh, by the way, we have to fit qual sims and race, practice into the same practice session while everybody else is doing the same thing. So that ends up being like a total cluster. It's just far from ideal in terms of seeing people at their best once you get to the race, giving people a chance to even like kind of explore what that is for them. And then I'll kind of stand back and just look at it from the series perspective. We clearly see, we're doing this because it's kind of bang for the buck. I guess theoretically there's some advantages from maybe the promoters like this, because they've got something that they've got a good reason to get people to show up for 2 days instead of just one. So I don't want to completely downplay the fact that there are some upsides to this. It does add more points paying races to the schedule, blah blah blah. So there are some things, I guess, that are positive. I'll sort of take a couple of Alex Plow's comments and just echo them in a different way, though, which are that these doubleheader weekends always felt to me, having been a part of them, on some ovals. Detroit was always a doubleheader, as a street circuit at Belle Isle. So that's the one that really stands out more to me. It always just kind of felt like a Mickey Mouse diluted event. Basically, it just felt like a watered down event, because you've got these weird qualifying formats that you're kind of just like, okay, I guess just go out and do it. Like you don't really, they're kind of over before you feel like you even get started, with the qualifying formats half the time. And then you've got one race that leads into another race. Yes, they're both points paying for the same number of points, but it almost just feels like, you've got half a weekend one day, half the weekend the other day. Neither event really feels like the main event. They both kind of feel like lesser than main events. So even though you're splitting it up into two races, you're not getting two races worth of just like emotional value out of being there and doing it. So it's kind of hard to completely get that across, but it's just like, by having two events on the same weekend, you're bringing down the ceiling of how much anybody cares about anything that goes on that weekend, basically, because it's just spread out in this kind of funky format, one part of it happening one day, the other part of it happening the other day. So you're certainly not getting two good races worth of like entertainment value or just generally like fan value, I don't think, out of doing this. And so my personal preference would certainly be like, can we just make every one of these venues great, like truly great, like pick the absolute best time for one of the, at Iowa, surely this is better as a Saturday night race than it is as anything else. Like, can we just make it really awesome as a Saturday night special, and try to do, the concerts, all the stuff, like try to do all the things to really pack it in and make that totally badass as, one event. And then try to look at the other places like that. Like that to me just feels it's definitely going to be easier on the teams, especially when you have weekends that are like back to back to back, like this one is. This is in the middle of a, 3 event back to back to back, sort of rundown here as a part of the schedule. Relieve a little bit of that pressure on the teams to have to, be up till the middle of the night. I mean, these guys are just they're not getting sleep. They're not getting rested. This is total burnout for the teams as they're going through it, as they're going through these weekends, just as it is. And try to focus more on where the max value from I don't know, just a general like gravity around the events can kind of come from. And to me, that just having, IndyCar's done this thing for a long time, kind of dabbling with doubleheader events. It just doesn't really feel like the doubleheader events ever achieve that at these places.
Definitely feel like the on-track element hasn't helped, because this Hy-Vee weekend has been extremely popular since it came back in 2021 with all the concerts and stuff surrounding it. So that element has always been good, and we've seen some good racing there in the past. But the on-track product this weekend wasn't right, and that definitely contributed to the whole thing. I like your opinions on double headers, JR. I struggle to disagree, and I think the big thing we have to take away from this is protecting the people who work in the series, and I don't think that's necessarily been the case here at Iowa at all. And I feel sorry for especially like the hands-on crew guys who basically didn't sleep across the weekend, which was not great. I feel sorry for them, and hope that that's considered maybe a little bit more in future schedules. JR, we're out of time basically, but Toronto's coming up this weekend, so I mean, this is part of the reason why it's difficult to do a race recap podcast when you're in the middle of a triple header and you're trying to preview and review all of the races. We'll definitely be back next week with an in-depth look at how Toronto went. Also, there's much less kind of change going on at Toronto than there has been at somewhere like Iowa, so we've not quite dedicated as much time to Toronto as we would have liked, but Iowa definitely deserve that treatment. We've got the hybrid making its debut on a street course, so we can tick that box off. That'll be the last kind of track we see it on. That'll be interesting to see how it impacts everything that plays out there. And Toronto is always an interesting race and a fun one, and one of the last road and street courses for the drivers who prefer those to make the most of it and grab as much points as they can for the championship before, with Portland being the only other road course on the schedule apart from that, in the final 6 races, 4 ovals to finish. So that'll be very exciting, and we'll be back soon with another episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.